Despite tremendous economic growth around the world in the past 3 decades, some 2.5 billion people continue to live in poverty. According to Professor Aneel Karnani of the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business, while economic growth itself is necessary for poverty reduction, much more needs to be done to have any real impact. The author of a book entitled Fighting Poverty Together, Karnani argues for a fundamental rethink of strategy, in which government, business, and civil society each have an important role to play. Speaking to reporter Maura Fogarty, Karnani said the trickle-down effect, backed by advocates of the free market, has failed to materialize.
The efforts at reducing poverty have been dominated by a market-driven approach. The idea has been governments have failed and markets will help reduce poverty. At a macro level, there was a view that if we liberalize the economy and we get economic growth, wealth will somehow trickle down to the poor. Yeah. Well, that has clearly not worked. Yeah. Or at least if it works, it's way too slow and the poor are too impatient for this. And so these policies were often called the so-called Washington consensus, and that has been rejected by a lot of countries now. Then this view was modified a little to say that maybe markets will work, but at a micro level rather than a macro level. And one of the most famous attempts in this direction is microfinance, where the view is that give the poor people a small loan and they will start a business and climb out of poverty, sort of bootstrap themselves out of poverty. Well, the wisecrack is it's very difficult for the poor to bootstrap themselves out of poverty because they don't have boots in the first place. Yeah? And I think this is too romantic a view that the poor will just climb out of poverty. The second big movement I think that has not worked either is the so-called bottom of the pyramid approach to reducing poverty, which argues that companies can make money by selling things to the poor and help the poor in the process. Yeah. Now, this was a very seductive proposition. It said you can become rich and become a saint all at the same time. And I think this doesn't work either.
So what are these effective strategies then?
I think there are two critical issues here. The first one is, and by far the most important issue in reducing poverty, is to create jobs. So if you ask a poor person, what is the one thing that you would really like? I think the most common answer you get is get me a job. The poor are not so much entrepreneurs, they would like to get a job. And they are no different than the rich in this sense. So if you look at a rich country, 90% of the workforce in a rich country works for a salary. They don't choose to be self-employed. And the poor are no different. So I think the first issue is we have to create jobs. The second critical issue is I think we have to provide basic public services to the poor, like clean drinking water, sanitation, education, public health, some public security. That without these basic services, it's very difficult for the poor to do anything, even live. So if a poor person is dying of malaria, it's no use telling him that he should work harder. We've got to first figure out that he shouldn't be suffering from malaria. And it is the role of the government to provide these basic public services.
What you're essentially saying then is that governments should be the ones who are taking the lead in fighting poverty and not the private sector taking the lead.
I think the government has to take the lead, but there is an important role for business. Because the first issue that I mentioned about is to create jobs. And we have a lot of experience in the last several decades that business is the engine of job creation. So the government is not going to create jobs. Business will create jobs, but the government can facilitate that. But as far as providing public services is concerned, government has to take the lead. There is no way that the private sector is going to provide sanitation to the poor area.
How do you then motivate the private sector to create these jobs?
Well, no, it does work for creating jobs. So the business sector will create jobs because it is in their self-interest to create jobs and make money. So, for example, the country that has most successfully reduced poverty in the last 30 years is clearly China. And the way it has done that is by creating jobs. But most of these jobs are created by companies that are employing lots of Chinese people to make the familiar products like toys, shoes, garments. That's why China is such a large producer of these products. But the jobs are created by companies because it's in their self-interest to do it.
Can you talk about some concrete examples of what governments can do to encourage businesses to create jobs? Are we talking about just reducing red tape, or is there more?
There is a wonderful project that the World Bank runs called Doing Business Right, which clearly shows that many poor countries actually stifle business. So for example, to register a small business in the US takes a few days, but to register a small business in many countries in Africa or South Asia takes months. Yeah? And so we need to get rid of the red tape, as you said. But I think we need to go further than that. We don't just have to get rid of the red tape, we also have to facilitate the business creation and the growth of business by providing the right infrastructure, by providing institutions that provide financing, by training the people so that there are entrepreneurs and workers who are well educated. So there is no secret to this, but there's a bunch of policies that the government can pursue to foster business growth. But I think one crucial issue is that these efforts had to be focused on the small and mid-scale enterprises. Yeah. So if you look at any country, the real engine of job creation is not the big companies, nor is it the microcredit enterprises. The real engine of job creation is small and mid-scale enterprises. And so I think the government efforts should be focused on that SME sector.
What about the role of civil society? Are there examples of NGOs right now that are adapting to what you're saying is a newer and better way of fighting poverty?
I think the new way is that the civil society has two major and different roles. One is that of being a catalyst, and the second is of being a watchdog. Yeah. And I think those are two very different, but they're critical. So we need a catalyst because sometimes markets are not working very well, and we need civil society to show a better way to do it. And so, for example, I have a case in my book of NGO called TechnoServe, which is a wonderful mid-sized NGO that goes and stimulates SME sector and private entrepreneurs in many countries in Africa. So the market is not working, the government is not doing a good job of supporting the SME sector, but TechnoServe will go and stimulate it and be a catalyst. The second, I think, is that the civil society has to be a watchdog to make sure that business is doing its job properly and that the government is doing its job properly. So the civil sector doesn't have the resources to substitute for the government or the business, but can ensure that they do their job properly. So I think they have to be there is a system of checks and balances here. Yeah? And so if, for example, there is a lot of corruption in the government, well, then the civil society should expose that. There are companies that are exploiting the poor, and the civil society should expose that too. Yeah? So I think they should be the watchdogs, the policemen in some form here. Yeah?